George R.R. Martin has talked a lot about his own process and the writing craft in general, so I've picked out a few quotes that I think us writers can learn from that might help us with our own stories. So here's the first one. Number 1, I do not write the chapters in the order you read them. Each of the point of view characters has its own voice and vocabulary. It's difficult for me to shift from one to the other, so I used to write consecutively 2, 3 or 4 chapters of the same character. Then I stop because I've gone too far or because I don't know what will happen next. For me, changing from a Tyrion chapter to a Daenerys one, to put an example, is very exhausting. It demands a lot from me. I think the idea of writing a multi-POV novel is understandably pretty daunting to most writers. At least one of the same kind of length and scale as A Song of Ice and Fire. There's always going to need to be some method of organisation there. Depending on the book, it can be hard enough to wrangle one character into line, never mind 5 or 6 as is often the case in Martin's books. But having said that, I wasn't necessarily expecting him to say he writes a few chapters in each voice and then swaps. To me, that's really interesting. With all of the moving parts and all of the parallel storylines that he uses in his work, I would have thought that approach would make it harder to keep track of when and where things are happening and how the story intersects, but clearly he's extremely capable and organised in handling a big story like that. My book, Project Ventus, is multi-POV as well, but I wrote the chapters in the order that they appear, so alternating between each character, because that was the only way that I could keep the main plot in mind and keep track of that. I definitely couldn't do it his way, but I admire it. And I think he's definitely onto something in terms of keeping a consistent character voice. With so many different personalities and motivations and goals for every character, sticking with them for a little while makes a lot of sense. I can definitely see how it would keep things consistent and hold off a bit of that writer fatigue. And I generally find that anything that keeps things interesting for the writer probably keeps things interesting for the reader as well. By the way, I'm Kieran. I'm a writer and a freelance editor, and I love to help and support writers to tell their stories but have fun doing it. So thanks for being here. Number 2, we observe other people from the outside. The only person we ever really know inside and out is ourselves, and we have to reach into ourselves to find the power that makes great fiction real. I touched on this point a little in another recent author advice video, but to me, this is the scary and the brilliant part of writing fiction. Whether intentionally or not, we always write some part of ourselves into our story, whether that's directly in terms of character traits or indirectly in how our lived IRL experiences affect what happens in our stories. It's really impossible for that not to happen, I think. But the reason I say that it's a scary part of writing is because we're exposing a part of ourselves, not physically, to the outside world. And I don't know about you, but I don't often find myself writing about how the world is nothing but a bed of roses. Often the opposite. For us to, whether consciously or not, say, here's what I think of the world, that can be pretty daunting. At least I think so anyway. What if everyone else has no idea what you're talking about or trying to communicate with that? The brilliant part of it, though, counteracts that. I think it's far more likely that some readers, at least, somewhere, will know what you mean and they'll pick up on those same things. Maybe not in exactly the same way, but you'll be crossing paths somewhere as we all try to navigate what it means to be a speck on this big rock hurtling through space. That's what good writing's made of, in my opinion. That's what makes great fiction real, as he says. Number 3, I get up every day and work in the morning. I have my coffee and get to work. On good days, I look up and it's dark outside and the whole day's gone by and I don't know where it's gone. But there's bad days too. Half a day creeps by and I've written a sentence and a half and then I quit for the day and play computer games. You know, sometimes you eat the bear and sometimes the bear eats you. I've talked about writing routines and all of that stuff a dozen times in these author advice videos, so I'm going to come at this one from a slightly different angle, I think. I usually say that it's okay to keep whatever routine works for you and that routine's good, but it's not always possible and that kind of thing. But today, I want to talk about what I think he's referring to here when he says sometimes the bear eats you. And that's how it can make you feel when you want to progress, but you don't get to. I'm impatient, generally. Nothing can happen quick enough for me. Writing's included in that. And I've had to learn to slow myself down and to temper my expectations a little bit because that rushing has definitely made me miserable and a bit demotivated before. If we think about what we're asking ourselves in writing a story, it's far more complex than just scribbling down what comes into your head. If you're anything like me, there are so many more demands on your mind than that. If our one sole job was to write 2,000 words a day, and in that time we could shut off and remove all other concerns from our minds fully and completely, then I think it might be fair to get impatient if we didn't manage those 2,000 words. But none of us get that luxury. We all have jobs or schoolwork or kids or money or health or family or friends or in the environment or war or this whole host of other stuff occupying space in our minds. To expect our brains then to be creative and inventive and productive on top of all that, some days just isn't possible. Celebrate the days it does happen and try to rest on the days it doesn't, I think. Play some video games or something like George Martin says he does. It's important to support yourself during downtime as well as uptime. Number 4. In order to get inside a character's skin, I have to identify with them. That includes even the ones who are complete bastards. Nasty, twisted, deeply flawed human beings with serious psychological problems. Even them. When I get inside their skin and look out through their eyes, I have to feel a certain, if not sympathy, certainly empathy for them. I have to try to perceive the world as they do, and that creates a certain amount of affection. Even if you're only aware of his work in passing, or maybe you only caught a few episodes of Game of Thrones and haven't read any of the books, you'll still be able to think of a character from George R.R. Martin's stories that this applies to. There are plenty of them that spring to mind for me, and I'm only about halfway through the books, but even for those vile characters that do despicable things, I think he's right. You do need to treat them with a certain empathy. Not because everyone deserves a chance or because people should be allowed to make mistakes or anything like that, though to some extent that's true. But the reason we need to have empathy for them is so that we can do exactly as he says and perceive the world as they do. A bad character or a good one has to have their reasons. They need to be pushed onto whatever path they're on. They need to believe in what they're doing for some reason. Maybe some people are just born bad, right? Maybe there's no goal or motivation behind it in particular. They're just bad. But a character like that, I don't think will be very compelling for readers because there's no causality there. If they do bad things just because they're bad, that can feel really two-dimensional and flat and unrealistic for readers. However, if you present a bad character as truly believing what they're doing is right, if they're driven by some belief that they know something that no one else does and that they have to fight against that, then that's more interesting, I think. Everyone is the hero of their own story, so coming at it that way might make things a little bit more complex than the bad man is bad. Once you have those motivations and reasons behind evil behaviour, it's easier for readers to empathise with it. And you might think, I don't want readers to empathise with the bad characters. But are you sure about that? Everyone has a mixture of good and bad qualities. Total good versus total bad is frankly a bit boring. We're used to a bit more nuance in our storytelling. To me, the downfall of a bad character who really believes they were doing things for the right reasons, as twisted as those reasons might have been, will have more impact than a simple, evil person gone now. Hooray for the good guys. Get into their evil heads. Give them every bit as much care and attention as you do your good characters, and it'll enrich them for sure, but it'll enrich the good characters too, and the story in general, I think. Number 5, I hated to lose any good stuff. Scenes, dialogue exchanges, bits of action, so instead I'd go through the script, trimming and tightening line by line and word by word, cutting out the fat and leaving the muscle. It's the last stage of the process. Finish the book, then go through it, cutting. It produces a tighter, stronger text, I feel. Like I mentioned before, each book in A Song of Ice and Fire anyway is multi-POV. There's loads of different perspectives and they cycle through, each taking their turn. So they're quite long books, obviously, but I think they'd definitely be way longer if it weren't for this exact process. And in my opinion, the process he's describing here works really well. You can tell when you're reading that there's no filler in these books. Each passage and each chapter serves a purpose and makes its point and doesn't deviate or meander very far from the story at any time. What this quote made me think of in particular is how he starts and ends his chapters. He's got a really consistent approach to that I think is great for reader retention. It's all about cutting off the action quickly at the end of chapters and not allowing any downtime for things to get boring before he then throws you into a different scene the next time you're with that character. So things have happened while you were gone and then you have to catch up a little bit. The effect that creates, in my opinion, is that you're always moving at pace and that there's almost too much story to fit in. It also allows him to gloss over these less interesting things that nonetheless have to happen while keeping the pace of what we see on the page really consistent. I'm probably going to make a standalone video just about this effect soon, so subscribe if you might be interested in seeing that. But suffice to say, cutting the stuff that either doesn't need to be said for the story to work or just isn't very interesting is usually a good idea, even if it means making big edits. Painful, I know, I hate doing that myself, but it'll help you write a stronger story in the end, so be brave and cut stuff. Number 6. I actually hate the omniscient viewpoint. None of us have an omniscient viewpoint. We're alone in the universe. We hear what we can hear. We're very limited. If a plane crashes behind you, then I would see it, but you wouldn't. That's the way we perceive the world, and I want to put my readers in the head of my characters. Really interesting point here that I haven't heard anyone make before. I've discussed the merits of different perspectives a few times on this channel, first, second, third person limited, and omniscient, but I've never looked at it through the lens of what's realistic before. I've usually looked at it, as most writers probably do, from an angle of what's easiest to write and what's most fitting for the story, but I think he's really onto something here. By writing in third person limited perspective, which is what he always does, his characters are aware only of what they can see and hear. They can observe and assume things about other characters and events, but their knowledge is limited to what they have experienced. That even creates plot points in the books, where one character will know something while another doesn't. But what it most often does is exactly what he says. It pulls us down into the head of his characters. Omniscient POV definitely has its place, and when used well, it can be a really characterful and enjoyable perspective to read, but it's not without its complications. Of course, third person limited has its own complications, especially if you're writing a multi-person POV. As we've already talked about, it can be a challenge to keep track of all the different viewpoints and knowledge levels of a whole load of different characters, especially when they're constantly interacting with each other. It's complicated. Writing is complicated. So if you're looking for more writing advice and tips from your favourite authors, check out this playlist of a load of them. And if your favourite author isn't among them, let me know and I'll see if I can make a video for you. Thank you so much for watching, as always, and happy writing.